Chapter 32 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 32. Unwilling Service. Taking all things into consideration, I hardly know which spent the more miserable night, Briggs or his companion. Poor Briggs grew unmanageable. He would not go to bed and to sleep, and he would sit up and stare at Robert and growl. He was sure he was going to have a fit of sickness, he felt it all over him, and Mother could not come. She wasn't able to travel, nor able to bear the strain of sickness anyway, though she was nicer when a fellow was sick than anything there was on this earth. She would have no money to come with, even if she had the strength. She was poor, of course. Everybody was poor who ought to be rich. The mean folks had all the money. For his part, he did not see why so many poor people had to keep living on, when it would be a great deal easier to die and be done with it. Part of this talk was the wildness of fever, but Robert, unused to attending the sick, did not recognize it, and had much ado not to visibly lose patience with him. He could only look upon him as a nervous boy, who had no serious trouble, and perhaps needed a good scolding as much as anything. Not feeling called upon to give that, he considered a judicious letting alone the next best remedy. When the restless fellow finally tumbled back into bed, matters were not materially improved. He tossed from side to side, turned his pillows frequently, and finally threw them away, muttering constantly. To be sure, he fell asleep, but this by no means brought quiet. Tossings and mutterings continued, the indistinct murmuring being almost more unendurable than the downright grumblings had been. When, at a late hour, Robert gloomily resigned himself to the necessities of the case and lay down on the outermost edge of the narrow bed, he realized for the first time that his companion was burning with fever. He did not in the least know what to do for him. Also, he believed that the necessity for doing was not great. People suffering with severe colds always had more or less fever, and he had heard his mother say that it was no wise alarming when they were even slightly delirious. So, feeling that there was nothing better to do, he extinguished the smoky lamp somewhat after midnight, crept as far away from the tossing form as he could, and dropped asleep. A narrow streak of sunshine, slanting athwart his face, awakened him. Fred Briggs was also awake, and if more subdued, was certainly not more hopeful than on the preceding evening. Robert, looking at him by the light of the day, could see that his lips were fever-parched, and his eyes unnaturally bright. On the whole, it seemed probable that he would prove a true prophet, and have an experience in the sick-room. Much to Robert's relief, he was more anxious about the store, and that his employer should know that it was illness and not carelessness or dissipation which kept him away, than he was for anything else. This would make it necessary for Robert to report promptly at the store, which thing he was quite willing to do. "And what besides that can I do for you? Anything before I go?" he asked, pausing before the disordered bed, and watching the restless twists and turns of its occupant. "Oh, I'm sure I don't know. Nothing, I suppose. I wouldn't have Mother know for a kingdom that I am sick. Wasn't it you told me once that your mother couldn't leave your father to come to you? Well, we are in the same fix. My mother can't leave my little sister Nettie. She is sick all the time and suffering, and she is blind. That was what made me think of you last night. I wanted Mother, you see, as a fellow always does, and I knew I couldn't have her. Then it occurred to me that you had been through it, and would know how I felt. No, there's nothing. Nobody else cares whether I'm sick or well." "Have you nobody who would come and stay with you for a while?" Briggs gave an impatient jerk to his small and long-suffering pillow. "I haven't an acquaintance in town that I wouldn't walk a mile to get rid of seeing, nor one who would come to see me if he knew I was sick, and could help himself. Now go, please." Whereupon he retired to the farthest corner of the bed, and turned his face to the wall. Robert gave a little sigh. He was beginning to be sorry for the poor fellow, a little worried about him. but at the same time was a good deal relieved to remember that duty undoubtedly called him to the store. Still, something ought to be done. "Well," he said irresolutely, "I'll speak to your landlady as I go down. Of course she will attend to you." "Of course," came in muffled tone from behind the pillow. "Do so by all means. She will be as attentive as a whole regiment of mothers." The full force of this ironical statement did not impress Robert until he paused at a door below to meet the uncombed, collarless, partly buttonless, altogether untidy woman who presided over this third-rate boarding-house, peopled by young men with small salaries. Then he wondered whether it would not have been better to have taken the risk of leaving Briggs to himself, rather than to have exposed him to the possibility of a visit from such a woman as this. Still, her air and tone did not suggest the idea that she would hasten to his aid. Perhaps, after all, he might escape her. "Sick, is he?" Mr. Cady said, a shade of anxiety in his voice, as later in the day Robert reported at headquarters the cause of the non-appearance of number 13. "I've been expecting that. A most careless, reckless young fellow. I don't know his equal in those respects. The wonder is that he is alive." After this encouraging statement he walked nervously up and down the aisles for a few moments, giving short, sharp orders to the arriving clerks, and then returned to Robert. "Parks, is any one with young Briggs?" "No, sir." "Quite alone, is he? Do you know whether he has any friend among his associates who could be secured to look after him a while, until we learn what is the extent of his trouble?" "He says not. He told me he would walk a mile to get rid of seeing any of them." "Sensible friendships for a young man to form," said the elder gentleman with a curling lip. Another pause, with some more thoughtful walking about the store, and Mr. Cady came again to Robert. "How came you to be with Briggs last night? You spent the night with him, I think you said. Is he a favorite of yours?" "Hardly, but he sent for me, and of course I could not refuse." "Ah, then you are an exception to those whom the poor fellow would walk a mile to avoid. And it is your opinion that he is seriously ill? I'll tell you what I wish you would do. Just step around and remain with him for a while until we can make other arrangements. I should not like to have him suffer through any neglect. I knew his father in my boyhood, and his mother is an estimable and unfortunate woman. I have a very kind feeling toward him for his parents' sake. Indeed, I am under a sort of half promise to look after the boy. Of course, there is very little that I can do in that line, but if he is sick I want him to be taken care of, though I must say he has probably brought this trouble on himself. I have been annoyed with him for some time. Perhaps you can have a good influence over him now. If you will go around and do what you can for his comfort, and remain with him until someone else appears, or until I can make my plans as to what is best, I shall consider it a favor on your part." Can I make it clear to you with what reluctance Robert obeyed this request, which had behind it all the authority of a command? He was willing, nay, anxious, to do his best for his employer, but to go back, out of the freshness and sunshine, to the stuffy room where he had passed the night, and watch Fred Briggs toss about on that dreadful bed, and not have the slightest idea what to do for him, and but little inclination to do it if he had, this was a hard lot indeed. He made no haste through the bright and busy streets. He felt sullen and rebellious. He was not a nurse, nor yet a servant. Why should he be treated as such? He assuredly did not understand the way in which he was being led. He had enlisted, yes, and was willing to do his duty. But why was this duty? There is many a soldier like him. "He is not a friend of mine, I am sure," he muttered. "I think I have done my part in staying all night. There are people enough who can be hired for such work. I'm not one of them. Why doesn't he hire a nurse if he is sorry for him, and has such an interest in the family?" Robert's pronouns, though very carelessly managed, were all clear to himself. He gave a fierce jerk to the asthmatic bell of the boarding-house, and ran against the landlady in the hall. "I was just going up to your friend," she explained. I have been that busy that I couldn't get away before, but now you are come back he will be all right. I'll look in when I can, but I do hope he isn't going to be sick long. It adds to the work awful, and is bad for the house besides." "Professionally installed as head nurse!" muttered Robert in intense disgust, and deigning no reply to the sympathetic words, he rushed up the many flights of stairs. His patient had fallen into an uneasy sleep. His face was hot with fever, and the rings under his eyes were heavy. The sun glared fiercely at him, and the room seemed black with flies which were buzzing about, with every variety of torturing noise that great and little flies can make. Down sat Robert in the midst of this disorder and misery. So little of a nurse was he, indeed so little common sense had he where sickness was concerned, that it actually did not occur to him to shut out the sunlight. He looked about the room. It seemed by far the most horrid-looking room that he was ever in. "Not a comfortable thing in it, nor a neat thing," he muttered, contrasting it mentally with the one over whose appointments Joy's taste presided. "It's enough to make a fellow sick to be in such a place." Fred Briggs turned himself over 10 times in as many minutes, and at last awoke. "You here!" he said in surprise, and then occurred question and answer about affairs in the store. "That was very kind in him, but horrid for you," he said, in answer to Robert's explanation that the senior partner had sent him back. "I wouldn't have come if I had been you." "Have you had anything to eat?" questioned Robert, and was answered by a gesture of disgust and a fierce, "Don't you dare say that again." "Well, in my opinion you ought to see a doctor and have something done for you and somebody to do it." Poor Briggs groaned. "A doctor is the most expensive animal that has yet been discovered," he said with grim sarcasm, "and the something done and the somebody to do it all take money. Who is to pay the bills, I should like to know?" With such inspiriting conversation as this the morning wore away. Briggs tossed and groaned and dozed, and every minute the fever seemed to grow fiercer. No one came. People tramped up and down stairs, and rang bells and slammed doors, and screamed at one another down endless halls. Still no knock at his door. It was nearly noon before Robert bethought himself of Dr. Everett's words, "If there is anything serious the matter, let me know." He has probably forgotten it by this time, he told himself with curling lip. What had Mr. Cady's promise to secure help or the landlady's promise to look in amounted to? He grew angry thinking of it. Somebody should do something. The slatternly woman should send a note to Dr. Everett. He would give him a chance to prove whether he meant anything but words. With some delay and much trouble this plan was carried into effect. By this time the sun was shining fairly on the sick head. Still it did not occur to the watcher to shut it out. His own head began to ache, and the pangs of hunger made themselves felt. Finding himself late in the morning, he had breakfasted at a restaurant, and the contrast between the tables there and those served by Mrs. Saunders had not been appetizing. Now he was evidently expected to get along without any dinner. He rested his head on his hand and felt ill-used. Another quick ring of the long-suffering bell, decisive steps on the stairs, and at last a low, firm knock at the door. Chapter 32. Recording by Trisha G.